Key components of critical thinking. Have you ever wondered why some people seem to navigate complex situations effortlessly while others struggle to make sense of the simplest decisions? In my experience, it often comes down to one thing: critical thinking. Not the kind of thinking that just analyzes facts, but the kind that allows us to see possibilities, question assumptions, and form well-rounded perspectives. I have seen that when people cultivate critical thinking, they don't just find solutions, they discover entirely new ways of looking at problems. It's not about being right or proving a point. It's about opening doors to deeper understanding, exploring options, and making informed choices. And what if this skill isn't something we're born with, but something we can develop every single day? I like to think of it as a cycle: conceptualizing, cognizing, comprehending, characterizing, and finally, concluding. Each part flows into the next, and the more it's practiced, the more natural it becomes. Conceptualizing is where it all starts, the space where new ideas form. Could it be that we limit ourselves by only thinking within the frameworks we've been taught? I have found that breaking free from definitions, letting go of labels and assumptions, often leads to the most innovative ideas. But it requires a willingness to step outside the usual patterns and ask, what if this wasn't true? What else could be possible? It's like giving the mind permission to explore without immediately shutting down ideas as unrealistic or impractical. Then there's cognizing, the art of awareness. I've noticed that the sharpest thinkers are not just analyzing information, they're observing everything, including themselves. How often do we stop to notice our own thought patterns? Is it possible that half the battle is simply recognizing the biases, emotions, and subconscious influences that shape our thinking? I have seen that when people start practicing awareness, whether through mindfulness, reflection, or simply paying attention to their surroundings, clarity follows. Thoughts become more deliberate, less reactive, and maybe, just maybe, solutions that once seemed impossible begin to emerge effortlessly. Comprehension goes deeper than understanding. I've seen that true comprehension happens when we look at something from multiple angles, even ones we don't naturally agree with. Could it be that our strongest opinions are sometimes just unchallenged assumptions? I've often found that when people engage in conversations where they genuinely try to see another perspective, not just listen to respond, but to really understand, it shifts something. Suddenly, what seemed black and white becomes full of nuance. It's like a door opening to entirely new dimensions of thought. And isn't that what thinking critically is all about? Characterizing is something I find fascinating because it's all about describing something in a way that brings depth and meaning. Have you ever tried explaining an idea to someone and realized halfway through that you don't fully understand it yourself? I think we often assume we get something until we have to articulate it. Writing, storytelling, even just putting thoughts into words forces clarity. I've found that when I take the time to define something in detail, to really explore its elements, I gain a much clearer perspective. And the best part, it makes everything else, problem solving, decision making, creativity, so much easier. And finally, concluding. It's tempting to think of conclusions as endpoints, but what if they're really just launching pads? I've seen that the best conclusions aren't the ones that feel absolute, but the ones that leave room for new information, new interpretations, and continued growth. Could it be that the need to be right is the very thing that blocks critical thinking? The moment we believe we have the final answer, we stop looking for better ones. But when we stay open, conclusions become adaptable, evolving as new insights arise. Maybe the true power of critical thinking isn't just in finding answers, but in continuously refining them. Conceptualizing. Have you ever caught yourself thinking inside the same old patterns, recycling familiar ideas, and feeling stuck in a loop? I've noticed that the most innovative thinkers are the ones who don't just accept the way things have always been, but ask, what if there's another way? Conceptualizing is where everything begins, the space where ideas are born. But how often do we allow ourselves to step beyond the known? Could it be that the biggest limitation to creativity isn't a lack of intelligence, but a habit of sticking too closely to what feels familiar? I've found that breaking free from rigid definitions is one of the quickest ways to expand thinking. What if instead of defining things in absolute terms, we asked, what else could this mean? Or what if this idea wasn't limited by current rules? It's like shifting from seeing reality as a fixed structure to recognizing it as something fluid, something we can shape. And isn't that where the most exciting discoveries happen? The moment we stop trying to fit everything into neat little boxes, entirely new ways of seeing the world begin to emerge. Curiosity plays a huge role here. I've seen that people who question everything, who stay curious rather than assuming they already know, tend to come up with the most original ideas. Could it be that curiosity is the gateway to conceptualizing better? What if, instead of seeking quick answers, we explored ideas with the patience to let them evolve? Sometimes the best ideas don't appear immediately. They unfold gradually when given space. But in a world that values speed and certainty, how often do we allow ourselves that kind of openness? Then there's the challenge of letting go of mental filters. I've noticed that people often shut down their own best ideas before they even have a chance to develop. That won't work. That's not realistic. But what if the wild, impractical ideas are actually the seeds of something brilliant? What if, instead of dismissing them, we entertained them, played with them, just to see where they might lead? I've seen this happen time and time again. What starts as an impossible thought becomes something unexpectedly valuable, simply because it was given room to breathe. Another interesting thing about conceptualizing is that it's not just about generating ideas, but about seeing connections. Have you ever noticed that some of the best ideas come from mixing seemingly unrelated concepts? I think that's where real creativity happens, not in isolating ideas, but in blending them, stretching them, and seeing how they might work together. Maybe innovation isn't about inventing from scratch, but about reimagining what's already there in a new way. Could it be that the best ideas aren't waiting to be found, but waiting to be combined? And maybe the most exciting part of all this is realizing that conceptualizing isn't just for a select few. It's something everyone can develop. I've seen people who believed they weren't creative completely change the way they think just by practicing openness, curiosity, and playfulness with ideas. So, what if conceptualizing isn't about being naturally gifted, but about choosing to think differently? Could it be that the only thing standing between where we are and our next great idea is the willingness to ask, what else is possible? Cognizing, have you ever wondered how much of your thinking is truly deliberate? I've noticed that most of us go through the day reacting to things rather than consciously processing them. It's easy to assume we're making decisions with full awareness, but could it be that we're often running on autopilot? Cognizing is about breaking that pattern, actively noticing, absorbing, and questioning what's happening both around us and within us. And what if this isn't something difficult or complicated, but simply a shift in attention? I've seen that people who develop strong cognitive awareness tend to notice things others miss. They pick up on subtle details in conversations, recognize patterns in situations, and catch themselves before making assumptions. Could it be that the secret to sharper thinking isn't just gathering more information, but paying better attention to what's already there? Sometimes the biggest insights don't come from looking harder, but from looking differently, stepping back and seeing what has always been present but unnoticed. Then there's the internal side of cognition, awareness of our own thoughts. How often do we stop to ask, why am I thinking this way? Where did this assumption come from? I've found that self-awareness is one of the most underrated tools for improving decision-making. Could it be that the biggest obstacles to clear thinking aren't external distractions, but unexamined mental habits? And if that's the case, what would happen if we simply paused more often to observe our own minds at work? I also think intuition plays a fascinating role here. People often separate logic from intuition, but what if they're more connected than we realize? I've seen that when people become more present and aware, they naturally become more intuitive. Is it possible that intuition isn't some mysterious force, but simply rapid cognition, our minds processing patterns before we consciously recognize them? And if that's true, could paying closer attention to our subtle gut feelings be just as valuable as analyzing hard facts? Another thing I've noticed is how much cognition is tied to emotional awareness. Have you ever found yourself making a decision based on a feeling rather than logic, only to realize later that the feeling was misleading? It's easy to assume emotions and thinking are separate, but could it be that they constantly shape one another? I've found that when people become aware of their emotional states, they gain better control over their thought processes. Instead of being pulled by stress, frustration, or excitement, they can pause and ask, is this feeling influencing my judgment? That small shift alone can change everything. And maybe the best part is that improving cognition doesn't require anything extra, just a shift in how we engage with the present moment. I've seen people go from scattered, overwhelmed thinking to clarity just by practicing simple awareness. So what if better cognition isn't about forcing ourselves to be more focused, but about allowing ourselves to be more present? Could it be that the sharper, clearer thinking we're looking for has been available all along, just waiting for us to notice? Comprehending. Have you ever had a conversation where you thought you understood something, only to realize later that you barely scratched the surface? I've seen that comprehension isn't just about processing words or information. It's about truly absorbing meaning, seeing connections, and recognizing the layers beneath the obvious. Could it be that understanding isn't just about what we know, but how deeply we engage with what's in front of us? I've found that the difference between shallow understanding and deep comprehension often comes down to one simple thing: curiosity. I've noticed that when people assume they already get it, they stop exploring. But what if every idea, every situation, and every person had more depth than we initially see? Have you ever asked a follow-up question and suddenly uncovered a whole new perspective you hadn't considered? I think real comprehension starts with a willingness to go beyond the surface, to challenge assumptions, to ask why and what else, instead of just nodding along. Could it be that the moments when we feel most certain are the moments when we should be asking the most questions? One thing I find fascinating is how much comprehension depends on perspective. I've seen that two people can hear the same story and walk away with completely different takeaways. It makes me wonder, how often do we mistake our own interpretation for the full truth? What if true comprehension means holding space for multiple perspectives at once, even the ones that contradict each other? It's uncomfortable sometimes, but I've found that when we resist the urge to label something as simply right or wrong, we start to see a much bigger picture. And then there's the role of emotions in comprehension. Have you ever noticed how easy it is to misunderstand something when you're stressed, upset, or defensive? I've seen that when emotions take over, we don't actually hear what's being said. We hear our own reactions. Could it be that deep comprehension requires emotional clarity as much as intellectual effort? What if, before jumping to conclusions, we paused and asked, am I responding to the message or to my feelings about it? I think that single habit alone could change the way we understand the world. Another thing I've learned is that comprehension is often nonlinear. We like to think of understanding as a straight path from not knowing to knowing. But in my experience, it's more like a spiral. Sometimes we have to revisit the same ideas from different angles before they fully click. Have you ever had a moment where something finally made sense, but only after hearing it in a new way? Could it be that comprehension isn't a one-time event, but an ongoing process, deepening every time we engage with an idea from a fresh perspective? And maybe the most exciting part is that comprehension isn't about having all the answers. It's about staying open to continuous learning. I've seen that the best thinkers aren't the ones who claim to understand everything, but the ones who constantly look for what they might be missing. So, what if the key to deeper comprehension isn't just knowledge, but humility? Could it be that the more we acknowledge what we don't know, the more space we create for true understanding? Characterizing. Have you ever tried to explain something and realized mid-sentence that you didn't actually understand it as well as you thought? I've noticed that the moment we put something into words, whether by speaking, writing, or even just describing it in our own minds, we start to see its gaps, its contradictions, and sometimes its deeper truths. Could it be that the act of defining something isn't just about communication, but about clarifying our own thoughts? I've found that when people take the time to articulate an idea fully, they don't just make it clearer for others, they make it clearer for themselves. And I've seen that characterizing is more than just describing something accurately, it's about capturing its essence. Have you ever noticed how two people can describe the same thing in completely different ways? It makes me wonder how much of what we know is actually shaped by the way we frame it. What if the way we describe something changes the way we perceive it? I've found that when we choose our words carefully, we can shift perspectives, open new possibilities, and even change the way we feel about a situation. Could it be that language isn't just a tool for communication, but a tool for shaping reality? Another interesting thing I've observed is how much clarity comes from contrast. Have you ever tried defining something by explaining what it's not? Sometimes the easiest way to understand something is by setting it against its opposite. Light makes us see darkness, structure makes us notice chaos, and kindness makes cruelty more obvious. Could it be that we only truly grasp something when we see what exists on the other side of it? I've found that by recognizing what something is not, we can sharpen our understanding of what it is. I also think that characterizing isn't just about definition, it's about perspective. Have you ever described something one way, then heard someone else describe it completely differently, and suddenly your entire view of it shifted? It makes me wonder, how many of our beliefs are just habits of description? What if, instead of saying, this is just how things are, we asked, what other way could I describe this? I've noticed that even the smallest shifts in wording can completely change the way we approach a problem, an idea, or even a relationship. Then there's the question of depth. Have you ever read something that felt hollow, even though all the right words were there? I've found that real characterization comes from more than just listing details. It comes from capturing meaning. Facts are important, but without context, they don't tell a full story. Could it be that understanding isn't just about gathering information, but about knowing which details matter most? I've seen that when people focus on what gives something depth, its purpose, its impact, its nuances, they create descriptions that actually resonate rather than just inform. And maybe the most powerful realization is that characterizing isn't about boxing something in, it's about expanding its possibilities. I've noticed that when people think of definitions as fixed, they trap themselves inside rigid perspectives. But what if definitions could evolve? What if the way we describe something today could shift tomorrow as we gain more insight? Could it be that the key to true understanding isn't about locking down meaning, but about leaving space for it to grow? I think that when we embrace that, we stop just describing the world as it is, we start shaping it into what it could be. Concluding, have you ever rushed to a conclusion only to realize later that you missed something important? I've seen that conclusions often feel like the finish line, but could it be that they're actually just a checkpoint? We tend to think of them as final, as the answer. But in my experience, the best conclusions leave room for change. What if the ability to conclude wisely isn't about certainty, but about flexibility? Maybe the real skill isn't in reaching a conclusion, it's in knowing when to hold on to one and when to let it evolve. I've noticed that conclusions feel satisfying because they give us closure. There's something comforting about saying, this is what I've decided, or now I understand. How often do we confuse closure with truth? Have you ever reached a conclusion that felt right in the moment, only to later see the situation completely differently? I wonder, could it be that some of our strongest beliefs are just conclusions we never went back to question? I found that the most effective thinkers treat conclusions as working theories, not fixed destinations. And then there's the question of emotional influence. Have you ever noticed how our conclusions tend to align with how we want things to be? I've seen that when emotions run high, we often reach conclusions that feel good rather than ones that are actually grounded. Could it be that real clarity comes not from shutting out emotions, but from recognizing when they're shaping our thinking? What if, before finalizing a conclusion, we asked, am I seeing this as it is or as I hope it is? I think that simple question alone could prevent a lot of missteps. I've also found that conclusions are often shaped by the information we have at the time. But what happens when new insights emerge? Have you ever changed your mind about something you once felt completely sure about? It makes me wonder, why do we sometimes resist reconsidering our conclusions? Is it possible that we fear looking inconsistent or even admitting we were wrong? I've noticed that the sharpest thinkers aren't the ones who stick to their conclusions no matter what. They're the ones who stay open to adjusting them when new evidence appears. Another thing that fascinates me is how different people can look at the same situation and come to completely different conclusions. If conclusions were purely logical, wouldn't we all reach the same ones? Could it be that what we conclude is shaped just as much by our perspectives as by the facts in front of us? I've seen that when people take the time to understand why someone else sees things differently, they often refine their own conclusions in the process. Maybe instead of asking, "Am I right?" a better question would be, "What am I missing?" And maybe the most powerful realization is that conclusions aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be stepping stones. I've noticed that the best conclusions don't just solve a problem. They open the door to the next set of questions. Could it be that thinking critically isn't about finding one final answer, but about continuously deepening our understanding? Maybe the real strength in concluding isn't about getting everything perfectly right. It's about staying open to seeing things more clearly, again and again. The 8 dimensions of critical thought. Have you ever wondered why some people thrive in uncertainty while others need structure? Or why one person relies on logic while another makes decisions based on instinct? I've noticed that thinking isn't just one skill. It's a combination of different approaches, different ways of seeing the world. Could it be that the sharpest thinkers aren't necessarily the smartest, but simply the ones who can move between these different modes of thought? I've found that when we recognize and develop these dimensions in ourselves, we don't just think better. We think more freely, with more depth and flexibility. I've seen that some people are naturally extroverted in their thinking, energized by discussion, bouncing ideas off others, while others prefer introversion, working through ideas internally before speaking. Neither is better, but could it be that both are necessary? Have you ever noticed that some of the most creative solutions come from unexpected conversations, while others emerge in quiet reflection? Maybe the key isn't choosing one over the other, but knowing when each is needed. What if thinking deeply means learning to balance both? Then there's the difference between sensing and intuition. Have you ever met someone who focuses entirely on facts, details, and what's right in front of them, while another seems to see patterns and possibilities that aren't obvious yet? I've found that sensing is powerful for practical problem solving. It keeps us grounded, focused on what is. But intuition? That's where new ideas come from. Could it be that the best decisions require both, knowing what's real now while also sensing what could be? What if thinking critically means seeing both the present and the potential? I've always been fascinated by how people approach decisions, some through strict logic, others through feeling. Have you ever noticed how thinkers love structure, analysis, and clear reasoning, while feelers are drawn to values, relationships, and emotional impact? Could it be that neither is complete on its own? I've seen logical thinkers make flawless arguments that completely miss the human element, and deeply empathetic people struggle to separate personal feelings from what's actually needed. Maybe the best thinking isn't about choosing one side, but about weaving the two together: logic with heart, clarity with compassion. And then there's the way we organize thought: judging versus perceiving. Some people like things planned, structured, and decided. Others thrive on flexibility, adjusting as new information comes in. I've found that when we force structure too early, we risk shutting down possibilities, but if we stay too open-ended, we never move forward. Could it be that the key to effective thinking is knowing when to make a decision and when to leave things open? What if judgment and perception aren't opposites, but different stages of the same process? Maybe the most surprising realization is that we all have access to all these dimensions, even if we favor certain ones. Have you ever thought, "I'm just not a creative thinker. I'm not detail-oriented"? What if that's not actually true? What if it's just a habit of thinking, one that could be shifted with practice? I've noticed that the best critical thinkers aren't the ones who stick to their natural tendencies. They're the ones who challenge themselves to think in new ways. Could it be that the more dimensions of thought we develop, the more fully we engage with the world around us? Common barriers to critical thinking. Have you ever made a decision that felt completely logical at the time, only to look back and realize you had overlooked something obvious? I've seen this happen again and again, and it makes me wonder, how often are we tricked by our own thinking? Could it be that the biggest obstacles to clear reasoning aren't external distractions, but the invisible habits and biases running in the background of our minds? I've found that the moment we start paying attention to these hidden barriers, we begin to think with more clarity, more curiosity, and maybe even more ease. One of the biggest barriers I've noticed is cognitive bias, the tendency to see only what confirms what we already believe. Have you ever caught yourself ignoring information that contradicts your opinion or feeling oddly defensive when faced with a different perspective? It's fascinating how quickly the mind filters out what it doesn't want to see. Could it be that some of our most deeply held truths are just comfortable beliefs we've never fully questioned? I've found that when people actively seek out opposing viewpoints, not to argue, but to understand, something shifts. The mind expands, the thinking sharpens, and suddenly new possibilities appear where there were none before. Then there's emotional interference, which might be even trickier to spot. Have you ever noticed how much harder it is to think clearly when you're frustrated, anxious, or personally invested in an outcome? I've seen that when emotions take over, they don't just influence our thinking, they shape it. Could it be that some of our worst decisions happen not because we lack intelligence, but because we mistake a feeling for a fact? What if, before jumping to conclusions, we paused and asked, is this thought true, or is it just how I feel right now? That one question alone could change everything. And then there's the illusion of certainty, the belief that once we've made up our minds, we must be right. Have you ever felt so sure about something that you stopped questioning it? I think certainty can be comforting, but could it also be one of the biggest traps in thinking? I've noticed that the most intelligent people aren't the ones with the quickest answers. They're the ones who keep asking questions, even when they think they already know. Maybe the strongest thinkers aren't the ones who know the most, but the ones willing to admit what they don't know. Another surprising barrier is over-reliance on authority, assuming something must be true just because an expert said it. Have you ever found yourself accepting an idea without questioning it simply because it came from a credible source? I've seen this happen in workplaces, in classrooms, even in casual conversations. Could it be that true critical thinking requires us to evaluate ideas based on their own merit, not just on where they came from? What if, instead of asking, who said this, we asked, what's the reasoning behind it? I think that shift alone could make us far more independent thinkers. And maybe the most subtle barrier of all is mental laziness. Not because people are actually lazy, but because questioning takes effort. Have you ever caught yourself settling for the first answer that makes sense just because digging deeper feels exhausting? I've seen that when people get into the habit of questioning, not to doubt everything, but to explore, it actually becomes easier over time. Could it be that the more we challenge our thinking, the sharper it gets? What if critical thinking isn't about forcing ourselves to be skeptical, but about developing a natural curiosity, one that makes thinking itself more effortless? And maybe that's the most powerful realization of all. Thinking clearly isn't about knowing all the answers, but about recognizing the patterns that hold us back. I've found that once people start spotting these barriers in themselves, they can't unsee them. The mind becomes more flexible, more adaptable, and more open to discovery. So, what if the real secret to better thinking isn't about getting rid of these barriers completely, but about catching them in action? Could it be that the moment we start noticing them is the moment we begin to break free? Enhancement strategies. Have you ever wondered if thinking more clearly could be easier than we make it? I've noticed that when people talk about improving their thinking, they often imagine it requires intense effort, like studying harder, analyzing more, or forcing themselves to be skeptical all the time. But could it be that better thinking isn't about pushing harder, but about shifting how we engage with our thoughts? What if, Instead of making thinking feel like work, we made it feel like exploration. I found that the most effective strategies for sharpening the mind aren't about adding complexity. They're about simplifying, becoming more aware, and staying open to what we might not have considered before. One of the most powerful ways I've seen people enhance their thinking is by asking better questions. Have you ever noticed how a single question can change the way you see an entire situation? Instead of asking, is this right or wrong? What if we asked, what else could be true? Instead of assuming we understand, what if we asked, what am I missing? I've found that when people start shifting their questions, their thinking automatically follows. Could it be that the quality of our thoughts is directly tied to the quality of the questions we ask ourselves? Then there's the power of slowing down. I've seen that some of the biggest thinking mistakes happen not because people aren't intelligent, but because they're in a rush to find an answer. Could it be that real clarity comes when we allow ourselves time to process? Have you ever noticed that some of your best insights come when you're doing something unrelated, taking a walk, showering, or just letting your mind wander? What if, instead of forcing solutions, we created space for them to emerge? I've noticed that when people stop demanding immediate answers, they often discover deeper, more creative ones. Another thing I've seen work wonders is challenging our own thoughts. Have you ever caught yourself defending an idea simply because it's yours? It's so easy to get attached to our beliefs. But could it be that real intelligence is in questioning them? What if every time we had a strong opinion, we took a moment to argue against ourselves just to see if we still agreed? I've found that when people practice seeing things from the opposite side, they don't just understand the world better, they understand themselves better. I also think there's something incredibly valuable about engaging with different perspectives. Have you ever had a conversation that completely changed your mind about something? I've seen that when people surround themselves with others who think differently, whether through books, discussions, or even just listening more openly, their thinking expands in ways they never expected. Could it be that the most effective way to grow mentally isn't just about thinking harder, but about exposing ourselves to new ideas we wouldn't have considered on our own? And maybe one of the simplest yet most underrated strategies is staying curious. I've noticed that the best thinkers don't just analyze facts, they wonder. They don't just seek answers, they seek possibilities. Have you ever noticed how much more exciting learning feels when you approach it with curiosity rather than obligation? Could it be that the secret to thinking more clearly isn't about working harder at it, but about rediscovering the natural curiosity we had as kids? What if better thinking isn't something we have to force, but something we allow to happen by staying open, playful, and willing to explore? And maybe that's the biggest shift of all, realizing that thinking better doesn't mean thinking more, but thinking differently. I've found that when people stop treating critical thinking as a chore and start treating it as an adventure, everything changes. So, what if the easiest way to enhance our thinking is simply to enjoy it more? Could it be that the more we embrace thinking as a creative, evolving process, the sharper, clearer, and more insightful we naturally become? Practical applications of critical thinking. Have you ever found yourself making a decision only to later realize you didn't actually think it through? I've noticed that critical thinking isn't just something we use in deep philosophical debates or high-level problem solving. It's something that quietly shapes our everyday choices, whether we realize it or not. Could it be that the way we think about the smallest things, how we interpret a conversation, how we react to news, how we solve a routine problem, sets the foundation for how we handle the bigger things? I've found that when people start applying critical thinking intentionally, not just in moments of crisis, but in everyday life, their entire perspective shifts. One of the most obvious places I've seen critical thinking make a difference is decision making. Have you ever made a choice quickly and then realized later that you only considered one side of the issue? I found that when people pause, even for a moment, to ask, what other options do I have? Or what assumptions am I making? They make far better choices. Could it be that the difference between a good decision and a bad one isn't intelligence, but simply the habit of questioning before acting? What if, instead of defaulting to the easiest or most familiar choice, we got used to taking a second look? I've also seen how much critical thinking transforms work and problem solving. Have you ever noticed that the best solutions often come from someone who isn't stuck in rigid ways of thinking? I think that's because real problem solving isn't about following a checklist. It's about stepping back and seeing the bigger picture. Could it be that the people who solve problems most effectively aren't necessarily the most experienced, but the most adaptable? What if we approached every challenge not by looking for a quick fix, but by asking, is there a completely different way to look at this? And then there's communication, one of the most underestimated ways critical thinking shows up. Have you ever misread a text, misunderstood someone's tone, or reacted before fully hearing what they meant? I've seen that when people start applying critical thinking to conversations, everything changes. Could it be that half of our communication problems come from assuming instead of clarifying? What if, before reacting, we asked, what exactly are they saying? What might I be missing? I've noticed that when people make this a habit, their relationships, both personal and professional, become far smoother. Something I find fascinating is how critical thinking applies to information processing. Have you ever read an article or seen a headline and just accepted it as truth, only to later realize there was more to the story? I've found that in a world overflowing with information, the ability to think critically about what we consume is more valuable than ever. Could it be that the people who stay the most informed aren't the ones who read the most, but the ones who ask the best questions? What if, instead of immediately believing or rejecting what we hear, we got into the habit of asking, who is saying this? What's their motive? And what's the missing piece? And maybe one of the most overlooked applications of critical thinking is in self-awareness. Have you ever found yourself stuck in a pattern, reacting the same way, repeating the same mistakes, or feeling trapped in a certain mindset? I've seen that when people apply critical thinking to their own thoughts and behaviors, they start to recognize patterns they hadn't noticed before. Could it be that half of personal growth is simply the ability to pause and ask, why do I think this way? Or is this belief still serving me? What if we treated our own thoughts with the same curiosity we apply to the outside world? And maybe that's the real magic of critical thinking. It's not just for academics, scientists, or business leaders. I've found that it's something that makes everyday life easier, clearer, and even more enjoyable. So what if we stopped thinking of critical thinking as a skill for big, complicated problems and started seeing it as a tool for everyday clarity? Could it be that the more we use it, the more naturally it becomes part of who we are? And what if thinking critically isn't about making life harder, but about making it simpler, because we're finally seeing things as they really are?